last week. You'll know that this is webinar 2, ICT Standardisation, Underpinning Business Success. Leading on from last week's presentation, where we looked at standardisation in terms of what it is, why it's there, what the frameworks are from a global and regional point of view, and also we talked a little bit about national points of view as well. So I delivered last week's webinar. I'm not delivering next week's webinar, where we'll look more at IP, so the intellectual property and patents. And Chris Hall has kindly agreed to do that webinar, who is an expert in that field. So in terms of the agenda today, 4 parts to it. First of all, welcome and recap from webinar 1, which we've pretty much done already. Then we're into the meat of the presentation. So I'll take you through a slide deck and I'll try and build a story about why standardization is so important, where the opportunities are, and just what it can lead to in terms of the economics and the business success of individual organizations. We'll then go into the audience Q&A, and then we've got a closing set of remarks from Andy Reid from UK TIN, who is the sector specialist and standards champion with the University of Bristol. So Andy will just finish off the session right at the end there. Okay, so don't forget, questions in the chat pod as we go along, and there will be a dedicated opportunity to ask questions at the end. So underpinning business success. So we looked last time at what standards are, what the frameworks are around standards, how standards actually are developed. And this week, really, we're going to look at why we do it. Some people would say perhaps we should start with the why, but I think we've done it the right way around. Let's look at just what impact these standards can have. Now, I won't spend time talking about Wray Castle in depth. We did that last week. So we are a telecoms training organisation, and we train the industry and have been doing that for decades. Again, for those who were with us last week, I introduced myself, but I am full-time with Wray Castle. I spend my time delivering training or developing training courses, or trying to match training courses with training needs. I spend a lot of time on technical type courses, but I also do a lot in terms of strategy and business. I'm ex-BT from the 1980s. I'm also ex-Royal Navy, and I've also been the managing director, founding MD for some training startups in telecoms and innovation. So we split this particular webinar up into 5 different sections in terms of the actual content itself. So we've got the macroeconomics, so the macroeconomic effects of technology standards. We'll then delve a little bit deeper and look at the commercial impact. So we'll start looking at how standards, first of all, lead to commercial success, and secondly, how they can underpin individual company business strategies. Then talk a little bit about how you can participate in standardization processes. And then we've got some pretty good case studies. We've got 3 in the slide deck. We'll see if we've got time to look at all 3, but certainly we'll pick out 1 or 2 of those. So first of all, the macroeconomic effects of technology standards. And what better place to start with gross domestic product? So what impact do standards have at the national level? And it's quite staggering, actually, when you look at some of the figures. So this was a little bit of work that was done by CEBR. I'll tell you what that stands for in a second, which came out in 2022. Now, first of all, standardization and the impact of standardization, you can imagine it's a fairly niche area, right? So there's not always readily available latest up to date information available on it. All we're trying to do is get some sort of idea and some sort of scale, understand some sort of the scale of it. So this is from 2022, but I think it's recent enough. So this statement, we estimate that in total 23% of all UK gross domestic product, so what we sell from the UK in the current century, is attributable to the impact of standards, and 38% of all productivity growth. If you actually look at the numbers, it's staggering. So they estimate in that research by the Centre for Economics and Business Research, in a report for the British Standards Institute, they estimate that standards have boosted the UK annual GDP by £161 billion since year 2000. Annual GDP, annual, and that's since the year 2000. So standardization, if it is a big part of an economy, it can generate enormous wealth. So it comes in the form of increased efficiency and productivity. It comes in the form of facilitating trade and globalization, driving innovation and technological advancements, and enhancing safety and environmental protections. So that's the really big picture. That's GDP. Let's just look at the impact of standards on competition and innovation. Some big statements, first of all, by the ISO. You remember from last week's presentation, the International Standards Organization. So in terms of boosted productivity, a 2021 study by the ISO found that implementing ISO standards can lead to productivity gains of up to 20% in businesses. European Commission, growth of new businesses, a 2023 study by the EC found that the adoption of open source standards in the software industry led to a 30% increase in the number of startups over a 5-year period. I mean, that's just one KPI. You'd have to then look at the impact of that 30% increase in the number of new startups in terms of innovation and new products. So it's, some really positive statements there. It's not always positive. This is standards can be great for innovation. They can be great for growth. Sometimes you got to be quite careful. So Elsevier in Science Direct, they say that a 2016 study in the journal Science Direct found that strict formal standards can increase innovation costs by up to 15% in markets with low uncertainty. So if we're not really sure where a market is going to go next, and we start putting all of our research dollars into systems which are dependent on specific standards, sometimes that can be a mistake. But if there's a lot of certainty and we know where the market's going in terms of the technology that underpins it, then you won't have the same sort of costs associated. It will be that will then be generating more revenues. Missed opportunities. The OECD 2020 report by the OECD suggested that the lack of international standards in emerging technologies like AI can stifle innovation and hinder the development of these potentially transformative fields. So there's a lot of opinion out there. Most of it is very positive in terms of standards, but there are some pitfalls. So let's have a look at the commercial impact of standards. So moving away from the really big picture macroeconomic effects, let's start delving a little bit more into what standards do for industries and for countries and for businesses. So we'll look at that in the next two subsections in this webinar. So first of all, how do standards evolve within innovative industries? So once we introduce new technology, or when we're considering the introduction of new technology, what we find is that new technologies suddenly emerge. So we might be talking about something like, I don't know, perhaps mobile telephony or mobile systems, cellular systems. So we have a emergence of new technologies. Why? Well, all sorts of reasons can drive that. It could be that suddenly we've got more processing power available to us as an industry because at the silicon level, we've suddenly made some massive strides in terms of processing power. So it might be that suddenly everything's suddenly aligned and new technologies are possible. And lots of businesses do a lot of work on it. So there's a proliferation of prototypes, lots of prototypes. And lots of different companies come up with their own standards, or they get together in smaller consortia and they try to develop, very small, limited in scope standards to try and do a little bit of collaboration. So that's the introduction of the tech. A little bit later on, we have the initial adoption. So initially that will be fragmented. We'll have fairly ad hoc development and distribution of this new technology. The revenues will start increasing. We'll have some successes. And then we start looking at standardization. So it doesn't, standardization doesn't always come at the front end, but standardization will come when these companies get big enough and significant enough to start collaborating on a fairly, decent scale. So we have industry collaboration, engagement of standards development organizations, and we looked at the key ones last week, the SDOs and other industry bodies. We'll start, regulators will start taking note of these new technologies, and some dominant standards will emerge. And that's where it really starts getting interesting in terms of scale, because suddenly we've got global availability based on those standards. So you've got a market adoption maturity. We've got periodic revisions and updates, which are done on a coordinated basis. We've got truly globalization of standards. And again, if we just pause and just say, if we think about the mobile telecoms industry, this is exactly what happened. This was exactly the timeline. And we have market maturity. So individual markets mature. There's only so many customers in a country that would want to take a mobile phone. And those markets then mature. Everybody's got a mobile phone, right? In certain countries. So then the operators or the companies involved in those certain countries then start going after geographic market consolidation, cross-industry market convergence. So big companies like Vodafone start buying into other countries. The footprint of Vodafone suddenly goes from the UK to, a whole range of countries, Bulgaria, Spain, Germany, South Africa. And we've seen that time and time again in the telecoms world. And we have expanding revenues, and companies have become very, very successful, and they continue to innovate, and they continue to come up with these new disruptive innovations and developments, and that spawns new technologies. And then we start the whole thing again, because those new technologies are effectively the emergence of new technologies and introduction sometimes of new tech. And so the whole thing keeps going. And this is a cycle that we see time and time again within industries. But in particular, this whole series of webinars, we are focusing on ICT and telecoms. For sure, it describes what goes on in our industry. And it's not just for cellular communications, obviously, it's all the different aspects of telecoms. So how quick are these cycles? And the answer is it can be pretty variable when we look at ICT. So here's a bit of research that was done by Market Realist. They looked at each of these different technologies or technology areas, and they looked at the adoption rate, and they used a metric. The metric used was the years taken until adopted by 25% of the US population. It's very US centric in terms of this KPI, but electricity. So took 46 years to be adopted by 25% of the US population. The telephone, by the way, this seems to be in chronological order, right? Telephone came next, took 34 years to get to 25% of US adoption. Then radio, TV, computers, mobile phones, internet, smartphones. And the really big question you could ask is the cycle we looked at on the previous slide. How long does that all take? Because this whole technology adoption rate KPI is determined by standardization, companies working together with the economic climate and the spending power of the consumers or other businesses, and the actual utility of the technology. But big question, therefore, we could ask is which of these technologies converged on standard solutions the quickest? And I think inevitably, if you really analyze that, it's top left. So smartphones converged on standard solutions the quickest, not least because they had something to build on, which was what had already gone before in terms of the fixed internet and mobile telephony. These things were building on those two technological areas of innovation. So this really did converge on standards the quickest. So even from that point of view, if you look at the value of standards and the amount of revenue an individual company can make from different technological advances, the evidence is there, isn't it? We standardize, we tend to be able to go through that cycle faster and get on to the next technology. So the actual commercial benefits of standards, the impact, just by way of summary, is that standards, well, the trade's language. They can boost efficiency and safety. They can facilitate collaboration. They can enable individual companies to maximize opportunities, and they can drive research and investment. But there are some dangers. We did say there are some dangers. So potentially, standards can, if the dynamic's wrong, they can stifle innovation. We don't want every company putting in place different versions of the same thing. We want that innovation. We want those new products. And also standardization.
14.
Sorry, guys, can you just turn off your
62.
Guys, would you mind
52
or microphones, please?
This one.
Laura, would you mind just going through the list and turning them off? I can't do it from my end.
620. Yes. Yes.
Sorry.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Right, and we may exclude new entrants because actually new entrants into a certain area of technology, they might just find that it's too expensive to start developing their own products and services based on standards, competing against other companies who have products and services based on those same standards. So it's a balancing act for development. So what about standards and the structure of competition? Can we actually get some analysis onto this? Do standards impact competition? The answer is yeah, absolutely. So here's some work that was done by Compass Lexicon. So they looked at the economic impact of technology standards. This first graphic here, we're looking at mobile telephony, we're looking at operating systems from computers, and we're looking at television. And in this really simple analysis, we looked at the diversity. So this whole table is about R&D. So the top 5 patent holders combined share globally. So if we just take operating systems first, Microsoft and Apple, in terms of the R&D, all of the R&D spend comes from them. It's 100%. Just those two companies. Then you look at TV, and the top 5 patent holders combined share in these different versions of the TV systems, ATSC and DVB-T2, to 98% and 83%. Then you look at mobile telephony, where it starts easing a little bit. So in 2G, the top 5 patent holders combined held 69% of the patents. By the time we got to 3G, that had dropped to 58%. By the time we got to 4G, it dropped to 48%. So that's implying a more competitive market. So we can actually do an analysis of this. So you can look at the concentration levels in hardware markets. So mobile phones, TVs, computer manufacturers. There's this index called the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. So that goes from zero to 10,000. So if that figure was 0, it means there's a large number of very small firms. And if it's 10,000, it means there's a single monopoly company with all of the driving all of the sales in any particular industry. So anything which is below 1,000 indicates a very competitive market. So you see there, mobile telephony is more competitive than TVs and certainly more competitive than computer manufacturing. And you can see why. In terms of the patent holders, it's spread. We've got a much greater spread of patent holders in mobile telephony than we have got in terms of TV and computer manufacturing. So again, just backed up by this measure, the concentration ratio, the market share of the top 3 companies, the smaller the share, the more competitive the market. So again, mobile phone manufacturers more competitive than TVs and computers, at least in this study. So multiple contributors of technology and becoming more diverse as the standards have become complex and larger. All right. There are, don't forget, different types of standards. There's some standards, and I'm sure Chris will sort of talk a little bit more about this next week. There are some standards which have been developed by a single company with their own intellectual property, and they become a dominant design. So they're also known as the de facto standards. Really good example there where we're showing the Windows icon there, but also PDF. We used that as the example last week. We've also got those standards which are developed formally by standards development organizations like ICT. And then we've got standards which are undertaken, use a lot of collaboration, but within industry fora and consortia. So, for example, Bluetooth. So Bluetooth was developed largely by the Bluetooth SIG, Bluetooth Special Interest Group, drawing on a lot of pre-standardization or standardization work that was done elsewhere, certainly within the IEEE SDO organization. But Bluetooth itself developed very much by the Bluetooth SIG. And we'll have a look at some examples of that later on. Okay. So does that matter? And the answer is yeah, absolutely it matters. You know, who's developing the standards? Is it a single company? Is it in collaboration with other like-minded organizations within the fora? Or is it the formal process within the standards development organizations themselves? And in terms of consensus levels and in terms of development time, if you develop within the standards development organization like ICT or 3GPP or the ITU, it's going to take you longer, but hopefully you're going to get more consensus, more industry consensus because of those rigorous procedures and protocols. You develop within a consortia, something like the Bluetooth SIG, then it's going to be sort of medium development time, medium consensus levels. You know, it's going to be almost like not a closed group usually, but it's going to be very often confined to like-minded companies. When I say like-minded companies, I mean companies that have got a vested interest in that particular technology being successful, but by no means all the industry, all the companies in the industry. And of course, the quickest is to develop a de facto standard. So developed by a single company or maybe a company in partnership with one or two others. No real consensus because it's done in-house. We don't share, which generally in terms of standardization is not a good thing. But in terms of the intellectual property and the money you can make from those patents, it'd be a very good thing. But only if your standard is adopted. Right, only if your standard is used extensively by the rest of the industry or by the customers. So this is a real trade-off, isn't it? So do we stick to the formal standards where we've got really good consensus from the industry that this is what the customers will be buying, and all the all the or most of the companies within the industry agree, but it takes longer? Or do we try and go quick to market and try and push the sales and, hey, get really high percentage, something like the PDF standard? Or do we go somewhere in between, something like Bluetooth? Do we get like-minded companies together, develop something relatively quickly, and get consensus from the companies that really matter? I'm going to come back to that because the dynamics of that are really, really interesting. Generally, formal SDOs and even consortia, we end up with open ecosystems. De facto standards, we end up with fairly closed ecosystems. Okay, let's have a look at how standards can underpin individual business strategies. And here's a really big question. Innovation and standards are the two things at opposite sides of a coin. Are they pulling in different directions? Or could you argue that innovation leads to standardization and standardization leads to innovation? Or is that just not the case? I think we've got to probably put a little bit more context on it, right? So if we look at it in a bit more context, we look at the dynamic between standardization and innovation. Standardization or standards, it's a source of codified knowledge. So hopefully one that lots of companies and lots of development is going to adhere to. And yet when you look at innovation, especially product innovation, it's the systematic practice of developing and marketing breakthrough products and services for adoption by customers. Those two things look like they're absolutely poles apart. But here's the thing. Modern standards are flexible by design and do not have to describe a particular solution to be implemented. Standards can define a general framework, which allows freedom of design and interpretation. Which means that companies, for example, just to put this in context, companies that want to start developing an IoT type device can go and buy a chipset, because the chipset is is the manifestation of the framework. And they can use that chipset with all the standard way in which it communicates with the standard base stations to come up really cost effectively with some fantastic new innovations. So I'm hoping that makes sense. That's probably the most important point in this entire webinar. So modern standards give us a framework, but they don't describe a particular solution. You can go and buy a chipset. That's the framework on which you then develop your innovative solution. So it's about thinking outside the box. But if you think about it, a company who wants to put in place that really innovative solution doesn't have to design that chipset. And besides that, they probably won't have capabilities to design the chipset. They want to go further than the chipset. The chipset gives them the standard solution for the communication bit. They can then put in place the actual innovative product. So hopefully that slide really illustrates, in terms of innovation, the value of standardization. So the impact of standards on individual businesses, positive impacts, well, it can increase our efficiency, speed to market, productivity. It can enhance product and service quality, improve market access, reduce risks and liabilities, and facilitate collaboration and partnerships. Perhaps the negative impacts, possibly, is if there's compliance costs involved. It could reduce flexibility depending on if you're thinking outside the box or not in this case. And it may, depending on the intellectual property, put certain companies at a competitive disadvantage if their competitors find that some of their intellectual property is included in the standard. So there can be some negative impact. In fact, there's a balance of benefits and drawbacks. But the business needs a strategic approach to standardization. So ultimately, companies that have made the most money from standardization are those who have strategically leveraged it across their entire business model, from product development to global expansion. And some examples are that there's lots of companies out there who are standardization champions, so standardization development and advocacy, and they take a full part in that process. So they're all over the standards organizations. They're trying to get the patents into those standards sometimes. They're aware of it. They bring in organizations together within the standardization process. And as a result of that, they're generating opportunities as they do it. Really good example we'll look at later on is Qualcomm. And also Qualcomm standard essential patents. So some standards, I was talking about the chipset earlier, that companies could purchase a chipset that's based entirely on the standards and then run with it to develop new products. Well, within that chipset, there will be standard essential patents that companies own. So every time you buy a chipset from a manufacturer, you're paying a license fee to some of those companies. And we'll look at what that's worth in a few minutes. But also, if there's standards, very often associated with that is testing, certification, and compliance. So companies that actually provide those services for the rest of the industry. And also standardization software and tools. So there's lots of ways to make money from standardization. It's not just about those patents. But sometimes it goes wrong. Sometimes there's too much inertia in standardization. Things don't move fast enough. There's resistance to change. So there's, we don't want to abandon established norms. There's legacy systems and infrastructure. And if that's the case, if standards are not moving fast enough, we get stifled innovation, reduced competitiveness. A really good example in telecoms is voice over LTE. It took an age for telecoms operators to move to voice over IP type systems. Voice over LTE is the equivalent in mobile. So that's too much inertia. What about too much momentum? Well, absolutely. So standards being developed too rapidly because the companies involved want to address specific issues or challenges. It's a dominance of a particular technology or vendor. There's external pressures, and consequences are, we make mistakes, limited consideration of alternative solutions, potential entrenchment, reduced motivation for continuous improvement, adverse effects on competition diversity. Probably the best example from telecoms is WiMAX. So worldwide interoperability for microwave access, which could have been the 4G standard instead of LTE. That's how it was being positioned. But there was urgency to address specific issues or challenges, i.e. they wanted to get out early so that when the Indian market issued the 3G licenses, they were going to be there ready with the 3G and the 4G standard. Dominance of a particular technology or vendor. Well, actually, vendor-wise, if you look at the WiMAX forum, the CEO, the CFO, and the CAO were all from Intel. It absolutely fits this model perfectly. And mistakes were made. So WiMAX Mobile, because of the radio interface that was adopted for WiMAX Mobile, the radio interface itself just used too much power in the uplink, and the mobile devices didn't last very long at all on a single battery charge. There were flaws in it. There was just too much excess momentum. So there is absolutely a sweet spot. This thing has got to be managed correctly. So if there's excess inertia, you need more agile standard setting processes. Collaboration needs to be increased. You need regular reviews and mechanisms for fast tracking good ideas. And if the standards are moving too fast, you need periodic reviews and assessment, flexibility to accommodate future innovations, inclusion of sunset clauses for outdated standards, involvement of diverse stakeholders, and promoting a culture of adaptability. So there are ways around trying to mitigate against too much inertia or momentum. So let's look at a case study Fraunhofer with MP3 standard. They developed it. So that codec began at the Fraunhofer Society in the 1980s. It's estimated that about 100 million euros in royalty income has been generated for the Fraunhofer Society through what we call fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory licenses, which is if you want your, if you want your intellectual property to be included in standards or as a big part of ongoing technology development, you've got to use the FRAND principle. What about Qualcomm? So 2013, around 3% of the smartphone's price went to the company as license fees. So that's based on those standard essential patents, which I'm sure Chris is going to tell you more about next week. Qualcomm, we can go further. So it's estimated that they have over, well, by this count, 263,708 patents globally, covering all cellular technologies, smartphones, connectivity, now intelligence. They're generating value as a company through licensing, standard setting, and innovation. And the patent value, 40 billion to 70 billion. Difficult to get figures on it. But you can look at the share price over the last few years, for sure. Qualcomm make a living off standards, don't they? In fact, the first 3G course I ever taught back around 2002, 2002, I think. The first two people who introduced themselves on the course was some really high technical guru from Qualcomm and his lawyer, just trying to assess what was being used in 3G because we were making money from the patents. But a lot of companies do get involved in standardization development and advocacy. And by way of example, if you've got something like ICT, you've got all sorts of different industries who want to make use of the ICT standard systems, whether it's utilities, whether it's critical communications, or whether it's maritime or the railways. And there's got to be some interaction between the industries. So if you've got companies who are trying to bring industries together within the fora or within the standards development organization, the question can be asked, who's coordinating all of that? Well, it may well be coming through those bodies, those coordinating bodies, but actually it's individuals, isn't it? Those individuals know what's going on. They know which other industries and which companies within those industries need solutions. So they're probably best placed. If you really get involved in standardization, development, and advocacy, you're in a really good place to realize some of those opportunities. So we can get involved in standardization. Companies can join standards development organizations. They can participate in those committees and those work groups. They can engage in the consortia, Bluetooth SIG, perhaps GSM Association. They can contribute to open source development. They can provide technical expertise to share their own knowledge and their own insights, perhaps based on their own IP and their own patents. They can lobby and they can, through advocacy, shape the regulatory environment. That's exactly what the WiMAX Forum was trying to do in India. They can collaborate with academia and help fund and support standards development organizations. So if you participate, you can shape the industry's future, promote interoperability and foster innovation, and start realizing through increased knowledge what's going on and what opportunities there are going forwards. Individuals can sometimes join some of the organizations. Individuals can engage with industry, participate in open source projects, attend conferences and workshops, collaborate with academic institutions, and engage with government. So individuals can do this as well. Of course, UKTIN, so the UK Telecoms Innovation Network, can help with all of this, and I'll leave that to Andy to expand on a little bit later on. what I want to do is just look at a couple of case studies before we leave the slide deck. First one is 5G. So we'll look at 5G, then we'll look at something specific in 5G called slice, and then we'll just have a really quick look at something called prepaid. We know what prepaid is, don't we? So 5G generally is a framework, and it provides a framework to be able to move IP packets around, Ethernet packets, which can then be used by different industries for their own protocols and their own specific information. And also unstructured data, which is just another way of saying anything you want. We can move anything that a Internet of Things device would understand. So 5G can move anything. It can be deployed as part of an existing 4G network. It will give us great capabilities over and above what 4G will give us, or it can be deployed as a standalone new radio network. It can just be deployed as a 5G network. It can actually provide support for Wi-Fi radio connectivity. So 5G can support Wi-Fi and fixed. And also it can support satellite, so different types of radio. And different deployment types, different commercial models. So it can support the public network, the private networks. It can support private networks on the public network infrastructure and local data network. It can do all of that. It is what I said earlier. It's a really flexible platform, so standardized but very flexible platform for connectivity, innovation, and service development. And it's all standardized by 3GPP, a huge development ecosystem that's coordinated by 3GPP. But actually, once you've got a 5G network in place, how does a telecoms operator actually make money from it? And the answer is to provide different types of services, as we've just seen, to different types of customers. But it can be much more flexible than what we've talked about already. It might be that they configure their underlying infrastructure to deliver specific use cases, perhaps support drones or just normal consumer smartphones, or perhaps factory automation. It can be based on security needs. It can be based on specific industries, deployment types, or it can be based on some standard configurations. Lots of flexibility in this term that we know as slicing. So its capabilities and configurations are provided via a common underlying infrastructure, enabling us to manage the capabilities. And Ericsson think that about 30% of all 5G use cases will need network slicing. So how is it standardized? Well, on top of all that 5G standardization, 3GPP give us tools within those standards, throughout all the different documents within the 5G standards. They give us the standard slice identities, messages and parameters, network functions and procedures. Very, very flexible. Too flexible, because operators can do anything with it. So the operators then, within their fora, the GSM Association, the operators' representative body, through their document NG116, standardize the slices, and they give us more detail. So this takes the flexibility from the actual standards development organization and now give us some more specific information to take the flexibility and then narrow it down. And they start looking at the innovation that's required from slicing, and they give us some sort of standard versions of the innovation. Why do they need standard versions of the innovation? Well, because we operate roaming and things like that in mobile communications. So you've got to be able to access your smartphone in the UK and when you're on holiday, for example. So we just got some really basic, and these are really basic, so minimum standards, if you like, for pulling together the framework that 3GPP gave us. So I find that that dynamic is really interesting. That does explain a lot about how standards are developed. In this case, really specifically, combination of a standards development organization, 3GPP, strictly not an SDO, but for the purposes of this conversation, let's call it one, and the GSMA. Okay, and then finally, if we just end with prepaid mobile, just as an example, so we had a problem. Now, we've overcome that problem because you can see two examples. UK, which is predominantly a post-paid society, so we pay for our mobile phones after we've used the services, and South Africa, which is predominantly a prepaid society, so they pay for the mobile phone calls and data before they use it. We pay more for ours than they pay for theirs, but that's by the by. So in a world of 8.3 billion subscriptions, now over 70% are prepaid, but that never used to be the case until South Africa got involved, because they had a problem. They said, how might we provide communication services for a large population in a country where most people do not have a bank account? I mean, this is an innovation statement, by the way. This is what we might use when we're talking about innovative processes. So how might we provide communication services for a large population in a country where most people do not have a bank account? So they came up with a solution. And what they did was they looked at what standards, what frameworks were in place, and we had lots of ways for the network kit to talk to each other. This signaling system number 7, it was a standard from the ITU. We had SIM cards, which were standardized initially for the banking industry and then adopted some of those standards brought over to mobile, and that was already in place. And we had billing systems, which had some standardization within it as well. And what those clever people in Vodacom did was they used some other standards which were being developed at the time in association, or a lot of this came out of Ericsson, customized applications for mobile networks, enhanced logic, together with new developments in admin and management systems and real-time rating and credit within the billing systems. Based on all of that, they built a prepaid system, and it was all based on standards. So it's collaboration between vendors, operators, ITU, ETSI, 3GPP, etc. So the results, no new network kit was needed. Just had to build in some additional software into those. Billing systems now include standard prepaid capabilities. SMS and data is included now as well. And there's no new prepaid specific handsets required. So really neat solutions. And there are billions of global subscribers who are now prepaid. But you can ask the question, what would have happened if that wasn't based on standards? Okay, so we've got time for a few questions now. Actually, if anybody's got any questions, I'll hand over to Andy to finish off the session. But hope you found those slides useful. Remember, next week we're going to look at some of those standard essential patents and some of the specific IP issues. Chris is going to take you through that. Got any questions? Any points? Thanks, Laura. So how do companies balance the need to protect proprietary technologies while contributing to open standards? It's absolutely a balancing act. It is a balancing act. So the thinking is that if you contribute to a standard which absolutely goes global, and is going to sell in the millions and billions, then you're going to get through, including your patents and your intellectual property in that standard, you're going to get a cut of everything that's sold. But you've got to balance that against the against the assessment of what happens if we kept this to ourselves and it didn't become part of a global standards through those big standards development organizations. Can we sell enough of this and get 100% of everything that's sold? Would that be worth more than if we actually contributed to the standards? And it's balancing that. I think in general, it's a speed at which things can develop and scale. Do you remember that chart I showed earlier? How long does it take for a technology to reach 25% of the American population? That's what we're trying to show with that particular slide. The more you standardize, the more you sell, and then you've got the bandwidth to move on to the next technology then. So I don't know if that answered it, Laura, but hopefully it was fairly close. Right. Any other questions? Any other? You can always email in, guys, if you think of any questions after the webinar. Okay, I think we'll just I'll hand over to Andy then if you're ready to go, Andy, and if you want to just finish off. But I want to see you all next week, guys. So if you return next week, hope it goes well. I'm sure it will with Chris. But good luck in everything that you do. Andy, if I turn over to you now for the last few slides.
Hi, well, good afternoon, and just to repeat, I think for those of you that were on last week, basic message that UK TIN is an organisation set up with government funding. Oh, do you have the next slide? That it's the base. There's some 4 base companies or organizations that sort of underpin it, but it's meant to be an industry-wide collaboration. Basic message is we're here to help. What you've heard from Tony of necessity is fairly general. What we hopefully can do is if you've got specific questions, we can help one-to-one. We can hopefully understand your particular question, your particular opportunity that you're looking at, and look at what the standards implications are, whether standards can help you, whether or not there's an opportunity, whether or not there's some standards that it should be relevant to take into account, whether actually just you've got potential for a standards essential patent. We can help with that. And I think on next slide, there's within UK TIN, there are 3 of us. We're available. We're all just recently retired from a long time in the industry. I was with BT for 40 years and have been involved in mainly internet and fixed network standards. Howard has been a member of 3GPP. He's been a chairman within 3GPP, has recently retired from Samsung. Luis has been with Qualcomm and has recently retired. So we cover quite a broad spectrum. But because we're retired, we've got no axe to grind. We can help. And I say, particularly, follow that link. That will come through. We can talk one-to-one. That's what we're here to do. It's not just standards. On the final slide, and this is, I think, more or less what Tony had already put up. There's a whole variety of different things, that is information and also access to various people who can help on all sorts of different subjects, different matters. So, for example, intellectual property is one. Funding from funding agencies is another thing that can help with. If you're looking to navigate UK regulatory system, that's another thing that can help with. So there's a whole variety of things. So basic messages: do register, do join, and we are here to help. Tony's just highlighting there. That's an inquiries. It's also, even before you do that, the one right at the top is, if you haven't already done so, do register with UK TIN. You can register as a company, you can register as an individual. That doesn't matter. Once you register, then you've got a contact. We've got a contact. You'll be able to get access to all of these things. I think that was my last slide.
Okay. I think we'll probably end it there. And like Andy and Tony said, you can email in any questions. We're going to follow up with the slides and the recording, and we look forward to seeing you all next week.
Thanks, Becky. Thanks, Laura, and thanks everybody.
Guys.
And there's a message there from Chris in the chat pod if anybody just wants to take a quick look just on next week. He's going to see you next week. So take care, everybody, and hope you enjoyed it.
Thanks, Tony.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.